Tyranny is not something that usually happens in a big melodramatic swoop. Oftentimes it happens incrementally, but it's happened in Brazil quite rapidly. And I think that the most powerful person in Brazil by far is the Supreme Court Justice. And I think it's important to note that because tyranny can come from a lot of places, including from the courts when the law starts getting weaponized. Everybody always has a reason for authoritarianism. Some external threat, some domestic threat. That's always the playbook. That's always the formula. If you are in Brazil and you try and watch this program on Rumble or any other show on Rumble, this is the message that you get. Rumble is no longer available at all in Brazil, just like it's no longer available in France. And here's what the message says, quote, notice to users in Brazil, because the Brazilian government demands to remove creators from our platform, Rumble is currently unavailable in Brazil. We are challenging these government demands and hope to restore access soon. And the reason is that Rumble just every day gets order after order after order requiring censorship with which they do not agree and they don't want to be an agent of it. And so they would rather sue Brazil and lose access to their country than become an agent of censorship for the government. But this has become commonplace, not just censorship. There are a lot of top Bolsonaro officials who have been subject to search and seizures of their homes, who are exiled in the United States because if they come back, they will be arrested. And several of Bolsonaro's top aides, including his top advisor on foreign policy, Felipe Martins, who's a young, highly educated foreign policy expert, is now in prison. What is amazing is that this all happens without due process. He was just ordered in prison by the Supreme Court preventatively pending his trial. And what happens in Brazil is influential for the entire region of Latin America, but also for the Western Hemisphere. And what has been happening in Brazil is the implementation of a censorship regime that is more extreme than almost in any other country, where it is routine, as we've repeatedly reported, for the Supreme Court of Brazil to simply issue orders declaring people banned from social media without any process, without charging them with any crime. The Supreme Court issues a ruling, sends them to a social media company, says you are hereby required to ban this person or remove this post. There's no appeal process, there's no explanation needed. And a huge number of people who are supporters of the Bolsonaro movement or who are critics of the current government, which is the government of Lula da Silva, are banned from social media entirely, including members of Congress, members of the Senate, prominent journalists. If you try and access their social media, you will get a message from Facebook and Google and Twitter saying this account has been banned by Brazilian authorities and is not accessible. Yesterday, Tucker Carlson conducted an interview with two prominent Brazilian conservatives, Paulo Figueiredo and Eduardo Bolsonaro. I'm just going to give you the first minute or so of Tucker's kind of introduction to this so that you can get a better sense, again, of the kind of perspective he was presenting.
Brazil, and that's a big deal, not just for Brazilians, but for the United States, because Brazil is the most significant country in the Americas after this one. It's huge. It's got enormous natural resources. It's got a well-educated population. There's a lot in Brazil. And so if it descends into darkness, that's a problem not just for Brazil, but for every country in this hemisphere. So the question is, 2.5 years later, a year and a half later, rather, what happened in Brazil? Lula won in an election that was very obviously rigged.
No, when he says it was an election very obviously rigged, I don't know if he means by that the vote count was fraudulent, because I don't think there's much evidence for that. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but there's no evidence that I've seen convincing that it did. Or if he means by rigged, the kind of rigging that was done in the United States with the media entirely aligned in favor of Lula, which was absolutely true, with the Bolsonaro movement being constantly censored. The Supreme Court banned supporters of Bolsonaro and Bolsonaro himself from pointing out that Lula was convicted of a crime. He was convicted of a crime. A conviction that ended up being nullified in part because of the reporting that we did that showed his prosecutor was convicted, but he was corrupt, but he was still convicted. They were barred from saying that Lula had friendly relations with Nicaragua and Venezuela, even though he did. So a lot of statements that were at least politically viable, if not factually true, The Supreme Court banned the Bolsonaro movement from saying it. So if that's what he means by rigged, I'm comfortable with that word. Now, let me just add one more thing, which is not only did the censorship regime under Alexandre de Moraes, the Brazil Supreme Court justice, begin in 2019, but this judge, Alexandre de Moraes, was not chosen by the political left in Brazil. He was not chosen by Lula to be on the court. He was not a Lula associate or a associate of Lula's party. Much to the contrary, it was Michel Temer who first appointed Alexandre de Moraes as his justice minister. And I think that the most powerful person in Brazil by far is the Supreme Court justice. And I think it's important to note that because tyranny can come from a lot of places, including from the courts when the law starts getting weaponized. But because his primary enemy and his primary target is the political right in Brazil, the left worships Alexandre de Moraes, even though, as I said, when he was appointed to the court by the person who engineered the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, the left hated him and called him a racist and a fascist and everything the left calls people when they dislike them. Overnight, they became worshipers of his because he's putting people in jail and silencing their enemies. Now, here is a snippet of this Brazilian journalist who will explain what happened to him. And as I said, he's living in South Florida. He's a very articulate and was a very popular critic of Lula's government and a supporter of Jair Bolsonaro. And he's not only off the air, but his social media is banned, his assets are frozen, and there's a lot of other people like him. And that is the result of this Supreme Court judge.
And I was working normally on a regular TV station in Brazil, like mainstream media, doing a conservative show on prime time. We had millions of people watching it. It was the most watched political show in the country. And on December 30th of 2022, I received a call from someone that worked on a big social media company saying, well, we received a court order from the Superior Federal Court, the Supreme Court of Brazil, saying that we have 2 hours to take down your social media platform. And I had 1.5 million followers there on that specific one. And then I was like, wow, I'm not going to say the name because I don't want to expose the person that informed me. And I was like, wow. So I went live streaming and I said, look, so apparently I'm going to disappear. But later I found out because I got a call from a federal police officer saying, look, the order against you is broader. Apparently, they ordered to freeze all your assets in the country. They also ordered that we're gonna seize your passport and you can't get in the country. And I was like, wow.
What was the crime?
So I was never formally notified. So there's nothing anywhere that I committed any crime or that I'm being accused or charged of anything.
Now, I know that probably sounds unbelievable, like, oh, he must be hiding something, but he's not. So often, these people are not charged with crimes. Felipe Martins, who I mentioned earlier, the young foreign policy expert who was a top aide to Jair Bolsonaro, is in prison even though he has not been accused of any crimes. He's in prison preventatively pending his trial. And this has become very common. We reported back in January of last year on a order that Rumble received along with multiple other social media platforms from the Supreme Court judge. And all it was a list of prominent people in Brazil who all these social media platforms were required within 2 hours to permanently ban and remove. And if they didn't, they would be fined something like $100,000 every day for failure to remove them. It contained no explanation, no accusation of a crime. The people whose accounts are being removed and banned had no idea that this was happening. They weren't notified, let alone given an opportunity to contest it. It was completely done in secret with no due process. This is how this Brazilian Supreme Court judge operates, in the dark with no due process. So often sitting in cases where he himself is the alleged victim. And we were able to get our hands on one of these orders, even though it was supposed to be secret. And in the order, it said, you are required to keep this secret. Tyranny is not something that usually happens in a big melodramatic swoop. Sometimes it does. Sometimes you get big changes, a revolution, a coup. Oftentimes it happens incrementally, but it's happened in Brazil quite rapidly. And I would suggest the U.S. is not far behind, and the U.S. is on the same path with the same premises and the same mentality. And that's why Brazil and the UK and the EU and Canada and everywhere else in the democratic world that these measures are being implemented, largely because after 2016, the Western establishment decided that it could no longer allow core freedoms like free speech, because when it does, it leads to outcomes they can't control, like Trump's victory, like Bolsonaro's victory, like Brexit. And they decided that they, being the establishment, would do anything to shield their own prerogatives and their own ideology and their own power. And of course, they invent all kinds of reasons why their imprisonment of political enemies and censorship is so necessary. Oh, these people are dangerous. They question the vaccine. They're coup advocates. They want to overturn democracy. Everybody always has a reason for authoritarianism. Some external threat, some domestic threat. That's always the playbook. That's always the formula.